I don't see how them being able to go to the discount window and borrow money would meet the requirement of a reserve for the regulatory authority.
It would, because there's 100% reserve means that there's an equality between the reserves. There are two money supplies. There's the reserve money supply, and then there's the M1, which is basically what we're talking about. We're not talking about M2 because the time deposits are not really reserved. They're not under this system.
Yeah.
So what we're talking about is 100% equality between the two money supplies, the M1 and the reserve supply. So if you increase one, you can increase the other.
Yeah, but who's in charge of increasing them? That's the point.
It's quite simple. It's quite simple. The bank needs it because they've got customers. So they go down to the discount window and they borrow more. And that increases both the amount that they can lend and the reserve supply at the same time simultaneously, so they're in sync. And the thinking is that if they are willing to lend, they have assessed the credibility of the borrower, and so they've done so by an assessment of the economy, how well it's doing and how likely the borrower is to repay. So then it's warranted to increase the money supply based on the enlargement of the economy.
Okay, so let me respond to that, okay? Because that's still the lawless variability in the supply of the circulating medium, because the bank thinks that it's okay to make the loan. Okay, so my point is that with full reserve banking, the power to expand the money supply belongs now to the monetary authority. Okay, so it's up to the monetary authority to decide. Now, by their methods, okay, they're saying that, well, we could increase it by using the Treasury's bonds as a fulcrum, against which to manage the amount of money in circulation. But it's still, to me, their whole objective was to make it the monetary authority's determination of what the money supply would be in order to preserve, not in order to provide every loan that the bank wants to make for whatever reason, even though it could be a good loan for the bank. It's a matter of preserving the value of the dollar, and so keeping those two things in balance, keeping them.
Yes, I'm in complete agreement with you that full 100% reserve and the program for monetary reform that you're talking about is a halfway house to the need act.
Yeah.
It's not sovereign money.
Yeah.
It's not government-produced money, but they considered it a step in the direction of stability.
Yeah.
That's what they were looking for,
Yeah.
is to increase the stability.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And as far as they went well. They went very, very well with it, especially in terms of public policy, in terms of it being the public policy, in terms of it being the policy of the nation and the policy of the government, that we are going to both maintain the stable buying power of the currency and have a proper measure to achieve the prosperity that's available. So I think that my only observation is that is the way that they're going to do it. But to John's point, I want to say that they're not going to limit the amount of money in circulation or lending that can be done by the banks on the basis of moving to full reserves. It's going to have the opposite effect. It's going to stabilize it, and it's going to stabilize it as its, what I would call its optimal, its optimal level, prosperity, without inflation or deflation. James got.
Yeah, I think what Dennis was getting at is that there could be a slippery slope where the bank's saying, look, we've got these good loans, we've got these government bonds that we can offer them to the discount window, and there could be regulatory capture. The banks could capture the the Department of the Monetary Authority that handles the discount window, and so you could have a situation where the banks really are in control of the money supply again.
Yeah,
It may be for good things that are productive, and that may still equate to the purchasing power of the dollar. Maybe there'd be a case then that the Monetary Authority would say that there'd be some sort of credit guidance or window guidance for that it had to be for productive purposes. But who's to know that they could say, we just want to speculate on the futures commodity price of wheat or something, and that's productive because it's underlying as wheat, you know. And so it could be a slippery slope, and we'd end up back in the situation that we're in now very quickly. So I think, we'll discuss it in the panel, but I think we're sort of concluding that 100% reserves wouldn't really stop banks being in control, or potentially wouldn't stop it.
Well, to me, Jamie, it depends on whether you followed their mandate for making sure that the people that were on the Monetary Authority were the public spirited, you know, and empowered body. So,
Joe, I have two questions, just in relation to what Dennis said, Jamie said. Since reserves are under the control of the board of the Federal Reserve and the 12 Federal Reserve banks themselves, right? That's an amorphous kind of, you know, step away from public control. Just that, it was interesting because I hadn't really thought that. My other question, I always get confused because the Chicago plan came before this. What's the relation between the two, and the relation between the people connected, the economists connected to both?
well, you know, to me, the Chicago plan actually went further than this 1939 program. Okay? If you read the Monetary Control Act of 1934, and Jamie has the best link to that, Monetary Control Act of 1934 was the attempt to put the Chicago plan into legislation. And the first thing they called for was acquiring the Fed. Treasury acquires the Fed. And that's the first thing that we all call for. You know, Treasury acquires the Fed. There's no Treasury acquires the Fed, you know, by these guys. My suggestion with regard to that, because it was quite a play, if you will, among the economists for a substantial period of time, criticizing, joining, some of them who were in favor of it, turning away from it. My suggestion is to read Dr. Ronnie Phillips' book on actually the Chicago Plan and New Deal banking reforms. That's the title of it. And because he talks in there about how the Chicago Plan came out, it was really good. You know, Henry Wallace, you know, was kind of like the most progressive of the FDR cabinet, and he supported it. And there were a lot of economists, you know, who supported it. And again, over that transition period, let's say from 33 to 39, Fisher went both ways on the Chicago Plan. And my take on it is that Henry Simons was more, in the beginning, you know, he was more overt. He said, no, what has to happen is we have to stop, we have to end this not only the fractional reserve banking system, but we have to take back the creation of money from the Fed and put it into the government right away. In other words, that was his opening salvo. And then, of course, you know, stopping them from doing fractional reserve banking and have the government issuing the money. Excuse me. But anyway, like I said, to me, when I read that book, I know that you know, it informed me a lot. And Dr. Ronnie Phillips has a number of papers at the Levy Institute on this topic. So if you want to look into that, he was actually a consort of these guys. later, you know, in his later, in their later and his earlier times. So he had a kind of like a thread that stayed with it. But he was a real historian in terms of you know, how these things evolved.
So was the Chicago plan sent out to economists like this plan was?
No.
Oh.
No, it wasn't. They didn't have, I mean, they were trying real hard, you know, to put down on paper what their ideas were. And it was kind of an emergency situation if you think about it. You know, the national economy was, we had how many thousands of banks, actually there's a tale in here about, you know, how many thousands of banks, you know, failed up until 1933, where we had to have the bank holiday, where we had to have the gold, you know, change over, whatever. So that it was really pretty much emergency stuff. These guys, you could say, had the liberty of you know, having come through the Depression, 37, 38, 39. We were sort of coming out of the Depression again, July 39, and sort of. And so they had the liberty of you know, saying, let's make this a study of the economists. And I don't think the Chicago Pen people did not have that. Okay?
One question. The NEAT Act is very explicit in terms of how new money is to be created. It's to be created by government spending, basically. Is that clear in the Chicago Plan or this 1939 document?
Well, definitely not the 1939. Well, no, definitely not. Not in the 39 document, no.
So how did they then address the issue that the money supply had to be increasing as the economy grew?
Well, they did. Well, they did. But you know, their way of doing it was not through government spending. It was, and in fact, there is a section in there. I didn't include that section, but there's a section in there that says the new money that gets created goes to the banks. I mean, that is to say, the banks get it in terms of its to carry on lending. In other words, they have no sense of what I would call post-Keynesian types of economics, in the sense of the role of the government, you know, to take Keynes's idea about the government should be a player, and you know, and then to take that to a next step where they should be the player, or you know, the determining player. No, there was none of that in any of this stuff. It's really like, to me, the leap from the Chicago Plan to the NEAT Act, quite frankly, the way I see it. That's really the way I see it.
So the plan that you're discussing here is directly related to the 100% reserve,
Yeah.
Very closely related.
Yeah.
And the 100% reserve is a complete negation of fractional reserve.
Yes, absolutely.
Because you have a 1-to-1 ratio as opposed to a 1-to-10 or 1-to-500
Yeah.
or whatever it turns out to be.
Right.
So just recently, a couple of years ago, Joseph Huber wrote another book, and he discussed fractional reserve. And he discussed the role of velocity in fractional reserve. And the role of velocity is this. Fractional reserve is looking at the volume only, but the volume only is not an adequate measure. The actual proper measure is the rate of spending. And the reason that there is two velocities. There's the velocity of the M1, the public money supply, which is bank credit, and there's also a velocity on reserve. And every ordinary interbank transaction involves both types of account money, the Fed liability and the commercial bank liability. Every single interbank transaction involves both kinds of money, and you need to look at both of them to understand money. So what Huber said was that the reason that fractional reserve is merely a viewpoint, which limits the perspective to the volume, but doesn't consider the velocity. And the volume and the velocity together are the payment rate. And the real purpose of money is payment. It's not volume. And so he did not see the fractional reserve, the fractional relation between the two money supplies, the two account money supplies, as a sinister aspect. He saw it as a natural aspect of the fact that the payment system is designed by the Fed and the bank together, and they're much more efficient. So their velocity of reserve money is 10 times faster. And so naturally, even though their amount, their volume may be 1/10, the payment is the same. So he doesn't see fractional reserve as this big movement. He sees it as a natural phenomenon. And I noticed a similar sort of thing in Keene when he was talking about this ratio.
State payment.
Yeah. What did I say? Oh, yeah.
You mean Kane, not Keynes.
Not Keynes.
Steve Keene.
Steve Keene.
Steve Keene, oh.
I mispronounced.
No,
it,
no, no,
sorry.
I'm just checking.
Okay. He was talking about this argument that the taxes, the interest is not created, only the principal is created. But he says that doesn't take into account the velocity of money. So it's not the volume of money. People are too focused on the volume of money. It's the rate of payment that actually is telling in the economy. And so since you have 1/10 of the volume, you can have 10 times the rate. And the Fed money is circulating at the same speed as the M1, the bank credit.
Well, to be honest, I don't know, what to think about that. Honestly, I don't know what to think about that.
Well, here's the reason that I brought it up. This entire 100% reserve and the Chicago plan and the program for monetary reform is aimed at the fractional reserve. Fractional reserve is pegged as the big problem. But Joseph Huber doesn't really see that as something sinister. He sees it as a natural function of volume. The banks operate on a huge, small number of banks, but a huge, rapid turnover rate. So he sees the two payment rates as being equal. And the difference in the fractional reserve is being more or less natural. It's a natural result of the velocity and the efficiency of the turnover of Fed money in the payment system, because both of them have to turn over equally in payment terms, but one needs less volume.
Okay, well, again, I don't know exactly what to think, but my observation is Joseph Huber moves us to beyond reserve banking.
Joseph Huber is a proponent of sovereign money.
Yeah.
For sure. He's on board with the Need Act. But he's just a very intelligent person, and he has a wide perspective on things, and he doesn't want to make villains out of something that's not the real villain. He is a proponent of the Need Act, and am I right? Pretty sure the whole idea of monetativa is sovereign money. Vollgeld. But Vollgeld is the same as, they call it Vollgeld, but I read German, I got his book in German. So that's the same as full reserve. So it's not very far apart, it's like kissing cousins.
Yeah. Well, I guess my observation is that reserves don't move in the real economy. And so they don't affect the things that we buy with money.
I don't see how you can possibly say that.
Really?
Every transaction is an interbank
It's
transaction.
an interbank transaction.
The majority of transactions are interbank.
That's what I'm saying, but they don't affect money.
Yeah, but every,
Joe's just trying to bring up the idea of money in circulation.
they are in circulation. If you look at the accounting, there are three institutions involved. There is the commercial bank of the buyer, the commercial bank of the seller, and the Fed Reserve. So there are three institutions. There are transactions, there are debits and credits on the books of all three institutions. And you need all three of them to complete the sale, the process of transfer.
Yeah, but only in the payment system.
What?
Only in the payment system.
The payment system is what money is for. Why do you say only in the payment system?
Because if I buy services from Howard, I gotta take money from my account and put it into Howard's account. That's money, that's the transaction. That, the Federal Reserve controls the payment system, runs the payment system, and uses reserves in order to finance the banks themselves is immaterial. So the reserves never
It's
come out of it.
immaterial. It's not immaterial because the banks, their equity is not in bank money. Their equity is in reserve. And so the one bank pays the other bank in the Federal Reserve debit and credit transfer. So that is their way of paying. The customer, there's a debit and credit in the seller's bank, a debit and credit in the Federal Reserve, and a debit and credit in the buyer's bank. All three of them are totally required for the transaction to be completed, and that both kinds of money are needed. The idea that reserve doesn't matter or it's somehow vague or in the background just doesn't square with accounting. The accounting transactions are right played out in front in your face. And all three of them are required.
Well, they're not in my accounting.
Oh, yeah.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
No, they're not. Not in my accounting at all. They never get into my accounts.
Yeah.
What happens is when the money goes, the Federal Reserve controls every transaction. So therefore reserves are part of every transaction because they interbank the transaction. That's what they do. But it doesn't have any effect on the real economy and the amount of money in the real economy, the velocity of money in the real economy, et cetera, et cetera. Reserves are strictly interbank media.
To say that it doesn't have any effect is part of the gears. It's like the motor in the car. It's how it works. It wouldn't work without it because the bank that used to have the liability has now passed its liability to the seller's bank, and that bank has to transfer that credit over to the other bank. That's how the whole system works. Every interbank transaction works that way.
I didn't say anything about interbank transactions, and I'm saying it's not part of the real economy. I don't do interbank transactions. Nobody in this room does interbank transactions that I know of.
Sure.
So therefore, it's not part of the real economy. It's not part of the money system.
Huber talks about the two-tier circuits. The one is the reserve circuit, and then the other is what Joe was talking about, the real economy circuit, and the
I don't know why he talks about two-tier circuits because they're not separate. I mean, one is a liability of the Fed, and the other is a liability of the commercial bank. But they work hand in glove together, and you can't make the system work without it because the bank who has lost the liability has passed it on to the other bank, and therefore the bank has to compensate the other bank. And so this is the way the system works, and the attempt to separate it and say that the reserve doesn't matter or it's not part of the real economy just doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, I'll tell you what. When we reform the monetary system, you tell me what the importance of reserves are.
Well, you're going to remove the reserves.
Right.
I think what Joe is talking about is the quantity of deposit liabilities that banks create what Dennis is talking about is the turnover of a payment that has to involve the reserves and the deposits, debits and credits matching. But the total amount of deposit liabilities or account balances, you could have you could have a large amount of dollar amounts of account balances, but that doesn't necessarily mean that a large amount of, or a larger amount of payments might be made, you know, because there's other factors that, like the price of things, that usually determines how much money you have to spend. So I think it's two different aspects, and they're sort of like looking at it from different angles, I think.
Well, yeah.
Two thoughts. Dennis, when you start talking about the reserves, I get really confused, but then I always remember that the creation of reserves is under the control of the Federal Reserve, so it's in
It's a joint creation. The Federal Reserve is very compliant, and whenever the bank wants to borrow money, it complies. So it's just like your mortgage. The bank is walking down to the Federal Reserve discount window and says, I'd like some more, and the Federal Reserve says, yeah, sure, it doesn't cost us anything.
right.
So,
Right.
they do it.
The other thing, what was my other thought? I had this other thought about, oh my goodness.
Here, when you get it back, tell me.
Okay.
Joe?
He's here.
Where did Joe go?
I'm sorry.
Oh, there he is. Well, it seems to me that again, I'm talking over my pay grade, I know, but it seems to me that the idea of the reserve system is sort of almost from the idea of money as a thing instead of just numbers and accounts. So we think of money being transferred somehow from the buyer's bank over the reserves being transferred over here to this other bank, namely the central bank, and then it's transferred over here.
It was before 1933.
It was.
It was a thing, it was gold.
Yeah.
And so you're exactly on something, but it isn't anymore.
Yes, and that's the point I'm coming to. And now what I understand is that there are banks getting together to realize that they don't have to go through the Federal Reserve. All they have to do is have some information communication system so that the numbers change on the reserves on the two banks.
Oh, yeah, they do have to go through the Federal Reserve.
Well, I'm sure they do in some nominal way, but remember, it's no longer transferring money. It's just changing some numbers and accounts, and you can do that on a variety of sort of information systems. It doesn't necessarily require the Reserve in the way that it did when there was physical money being exchanged. It's a new day.
Like he was saying, the Federal Reserve is very compliant.
Sue's got a point, and Nick's got a point. Remember your point, Nick will go first. And I wanted to add last point, because I want to add an addendum based on what Joe talked about, the seal and the dumbing down of education on this.
Aren't we really talking about the present system? Dennis?
Yes.
I mean, we're talking about the present system.
I'm not talking about the need act.
Right.
Right, okay. So, when we move to monetary reform, we move to the Need Act, we're doing away with this system. We're changing this system. This is my understanding.
Yeah, there's no reserve in the.
Right, and
in the need act.
there would certainly need to be some sort of a clearinghouse done by the Federal Reserve or somebody. You know, the Federal Reserve will be put into the government to take care of straightening accounts out between the different banks.
Yes.
Correct?
The clearinghouse, you mean the whole payment system?
Right, the payment system between the banks to keep things in order,
The Fed wire.
but
Payments to become peer-to-peer.
Yeah, they're moving toward real time.
Right. But the money that will be loaned will be money that's already in existence.
Yes.
Not money created by the Fed and not money created by fractional reserve lending. Now, they'll get the funds to loan either by making agreements with people that now have more money and want to invest it in something, and maybe say, well, we'll just say, for example, they're going to make a loan at 5%, and you might want to invest in some sort of a security they create for that, and maybe the bank would split the 2.5% each with you, and that would be one way. And then another way would be that the bank would be able to borrow money from the revolving fund, which is held by the Treasury and the Monetary Authority at a rate of interest. And that's money that already exists, and as that money is repaid to the bank, that if they do borrow it from the revolving fund, for example, that it would go back to the revolving fund. It would not be terminated or extinguished as it is now. So the money would still be in existence. It would go back to the government to do as they see fit, to lend out to other money. At least that's my kind of understanding about what the reform would be. And I'm going to give a little plug for, and actually I've written this article, and I made a few changes or whatever. Gopher will be here tomorrow, and he's my editor. And one of the things is, the statements I made in there is when we start to explain the present system, especially when we get into the two-tier type thing, you know, that it's a guaranteed headache. And I think we're all getting a headache here, trying to understand exactly what is done now. And it's not, I'm not disparaging your understanding you're giving this, because it's very valuable. But understanding this system is a headache, because it is counterintuitive to the way that we think of what money should be and the way it is now.
It's actually very, very similar to the gold standard system that was. So it's not that hard to understand. It's just that instead of having gold as the backing, the base money, the Fed Reserve makes it up out of thin air.
Very good, thank you. That was very good.
Dennis, I just wanted to respond. I haven't read that part of Joseph Cooper about that fractional reserve
The velocity
is not the
payment.
is not the demon or whatever.
Yeah.
Just that even though the banks create money and part of it isn't circulating around, all of it is earning profit for that bank. And is that a moral issue?
The money that they create is not earning any profit at all. That's their liability. What
No, the interest to the bank.
the interest is, but the interest, there's a case for that, because this is what you need to understand, I think, is what happens when the money is created, when the loan is taken out. The very first thing that happens is the bank, that's the lending bank, pays its reserve to the other bank. So the bank pays first, and it pays its own equity. It doesn't create that out of thin air.
No, but who's paying the interest is all of us, regardless of whether we're circulating that
If I
money or
borrow
not.
money, I expect to pay interest. I'm not shocked by that. Because that money is somebody else's equity that they could be used for something else.
Right. I just wanted to add to Joe's presentation about this, and I'm not going to go into the banking part. I want to get down to dumbing of education, and your first acknowledgement to Lucille and the problem with education on this. is when Lucille was working on her 2 chapters, I was in touch with her and talking, and I had a better archives to work with or in Chicago, so I was able to help with the research a little bit. So I don't think she'll mind me telling the story. If you read the 2 chapters, they're very good, but it's very academic too, if you know Lucille. So I'm going to give it to you in a fun story form. But basically, Woodrow Wilson, or we all think of him as our president getting through World War I, et cetera. Starting back in the 1890s, he was in the college system, and he went on to the committee to help judge what should be the curriculum of young people growing up, particularly in high school. And as things were, and they were looking around, and in the one part in the German model was to raise kids more efficiently towards, rather than a liberal arts education, but more towards a jobs and technical skills, and aim them in that direction, and maybe somebody else would get the liberal arts education or the more philosophical oriented education. And this dichotomy in thinking, by the way, goes right up to the present day. But back at then, they argued in the committee, and he lost at first, but then they came around and he won again, or it came in the 1890s. He lost, I think for a little while he lost the argument, but that in part of the high school curriculum was we can take political economy out of the curriculum. And in the post-Civil War era, you have, the common, the populist, the Greenback Party, the Southern Alliance, Northern Alliance, the whole shebang. People could feel and think and know about money. They wanted to know as part of our regular education that came alive with the Greenbacks again. We lost it before, it came back alive with the Greenbacks. And then, and even though he lost the argument, nonetheless, it got into the curriculum thinking in the next few years, very late 1890s or early 1900s, and political economy got out of it. And then with the passage of the Federal Reserve, all of this monetary thinking went into a black box, only like the specialists could handle it, and that further dumbified. And so then you had the academics in the 30s, as Joe's discussing, talking about this, with the general populace not being able to really think about it. So our jobs today is to bring it back. We then came around with this liberal arts education post-World War II and with the baby boomers, but it's been under attack again, and political economy has been replaced basically with macroeconomics, but we lost the philosophical side of that, and so it's a very sad situation, and it's part of our jobs to bring that all back together.
The way I heard it described, which I always enjoyed, was the bribing of universities and professors to take the political economy out, Wilson being involved. But it was this notion that we could make economics a discipline that studies wealth while ignoring power. And then political science was the study of power while ignoring wealth. And political economy was a study of the relationship between power and wealth.
Very good.
Very good.
Excellent.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you, Howard. We'll move on.
All right, well, great discussion. I hope you're all still awake. Because we are going to have a meal after this, and Steve Walsh has got a shed load of wine, so I thought we better do this discussion before the wine, because otherwise the discussion might trail off into other things. So we just got another presentation from John Conroy, and then we will have a panel discussion and we can go through a lot of these points that we've raised throughout the day.
It'll be 8 o'clock over here.
It's okay, it's okay. This is the commitment that you've made by coming here. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone. So you probably all know John. He's been involved with AMI for quite a long time, and he's been doing his own study and thinking and research as well. And he's a Chicago firefighter, so he's one of Chicago's finest. So please give a warm welcome to John Conroy.